After the first wave of free agency, what are the Falcons' biggest remaining needs?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. So, guys, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. Drew, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast, and I appreciate each and every one of you that are illustrious listeners that make it your first listen, first watch of the day as everydayers. And if you want to become an everydayer, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we will be joined by some fellow hosts on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Lorin Cox of Locked On Bears, Alex Clancy of Locked On Cardinals. We'll get their thoughts on Darnell Mooney and Rondale Moore and what they're bringing to Atlanta. We'll get a little bit into what Alex thinks Desmond Ridder is also going to bring to the Arizona Cardinals as well. But we're going to start off today's episode now that we're sort of through the first wave of free agency into the second wave of free agency. Let's look at the Falcons' current team needs, right? It seems like for the Falcons, given their limited cap space, that free agency is winding down. We'll see what happens over the next month or so. But I wanted to look at sort of if this exercise in terms of if the Falcons had to play a game on Sunday, right? This upcoming Sunday, right? Where do they still need help on the roster? And the way that I did that exercise was by basically constructing a 48-man roster, right? That's the 48 guys that suit up each and every Sunday, and sort of where are the areas that are still kind of problem areas where you feel like, hey, we need to get some needs in here. And if you are watching the show, you'll see a sort of hastily thrown together graphic. For the audio listeners, I'll do my best to sort of describe what I'm coming from. But for me, when I look at where this team, they have, to me, 6 needs, right? 6 spots where I feel like the Falcons need to upgrade. And I'll break it down in a second, but in no particular order, that's wide receiver, offensive line depth, edge rusher, linebacker depth, cornerback, and safety, right? And the way that I constructed this is I basically, I'm a nerd. I got Excel spreadsheets going back to 2015, looking at the Falcons and how they construct their 48-man active rosters each and every Sunday. I went back and looked at the Rams and how they constructed their roster in 2 seasons, 2020 and 2023. Wasn't a whole lot of change, so I didn't feel as compelled to go back and look at the other seasons to basically figure out, okay, how is Raheem Morris likely to structure his active roster? And basically you'll have 2 quarterbacks on your active roster, 12 offensive skill position players. The Rams typically structure that with 3 running backs, 6 receivers, and 3 tight ends. I think the Falcons will probably follow suit on that. 8 offensive linemen, 6 defensive linemen, 4 edge rushers, 4 off-ball linebackers. So basically in your front 7, you're going to have 14 players in your front 7, a starter at each 7 spot, a backup at each 7 spot, 9 defensive backs, typically 5 corners and 4 safeties, and then, of course, 3 special teams players in your kicker, punter, and long snapper. Now, what I did, for those of you watching, you can see this, it's sort of color-coded, and I basically put all 48 of these players in 3 buckets, right? First bucket is the roster locks, roughly 30 of those guys that, lock is being a loose term in terms of what I think, but basically these are sort of quote unquote proven players that if the Falcons have to play a game this Sunday, you'd be pretty confident these guys, whether they're starters or role players, will have a role with the team. Then the purple is the want to upgrade category, and there's little less than a dozen of those guys that I feel like the Falcons, all of these guys have a role on the team, but I feel like the Falcons can potentially do better, whether that's in free agency, whether that's in the draft, but they don't necessarily need a body at those spots because those guys are functional bodies, whether they're starters or role players. And then you have the need to upgrade. Those are the 6 spots that, to me, that if you had to play a game this Sunday, you would be like, we can do a lot better than the current player that we have sort of penciled in to this spot. And so that's how I sort of categorize. So if we just go through it, right, the two quarterbacks I have, Kirk Cousins as a roster lock, Taylor Heineke's that want to upgrade. We want to find a young developmental quarterback in the draft, but if the Falcons had to play a game on Sunday, they'd be good to go and rolling with these two guys as a quarterback. And for that reason, I'm not as convinced as the rest of the world that the Falcons will definitely come out of this draft with a quarterback, but we'll talk about that in a second. The three running backs, the two roster locks are Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. They want to upgrade is that third running back, Avery Williams, who I think is probably not going to be the return specialist this year with the addition of Ray McCloud. But I think Avery Williams still has a valuable role as a person on the team's special teams coverage units. He hasn't been featured in that the last couple of years because of his return value, but I do think this year we might actually get to see that. The six wide receivers, four of them are roster locked. That's Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Kadero Hodge, Ray McCloud. The want to upgrade is Rondale Moore. The need to upgrade is Josh Ali, right? And I'm sure some of you are like, why did I categorize that? Kadero Hodge, because of his special teams value, is a lock. McCloud, because, again, special teams value as the primary return specialist is a lock. Rondale Moore, currently, if we had to play a game on Sunday, he would be the number 3 wide receiver, but I feel like the Falcons can do better. They want to upgrade that spot with a draft pick, but they do definitely need to draft a wide receiver, and ideally, that player will be that number 3 wide receiver, and then Rondale Moore will get bumped down to being that number 6 wide receiver on the depth chart. But that's how I sort of categorize it. Now, the 3 tight ends, 2 roster locks, Kyle Pitts, Charlie Warner. The want to upgrade is that third tight end in John Fitzpatrick. The 8 offensive linemen, the roster locks are the 5 starters. That's Jake Matthews, Matthew Bergeron, Drew Dolman, Chris Lindstrom, Caleb McGarry. You want to upgrade some of the depth spots, right? Your swing tackle right now is Storm Norton. You want to upgrade that spot, but you don't need to, right? Your interior utility guy that can play both center and guard is currently Ryan Newsel. You want to upgrade that spot, but you don't need to. But you do need a better option as that third, or really that 8th offensive lineman, that third backup, and then what Kyle Hinton is currently presenting to you at that spot. And so I do wonder, do the Falcons draft a swing tackle and that guy has tackle guards versatility, or do the Falcons do what they've seemingly done every year, which is use like a late round pick on another guard? And so far, those guys haven't quite hit yet. But we'll see if that changes this offseason. Now, switching to the defensive side of the ball, 6 defensive linemen, right? Your 4 roster locks are Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, Taquan Grant, and Zach Harrison. Your 2 want to upgrade spots are LaCale London and Kadavius Street, right? If the season started tomorrow, LaCale London is probably your starting nose tackle for this football team, and you want to upgrade that spot, but you do at least have a functional replacement level possible starter there that you don't necessarily need. But, I do wonder a little bit if the Falcons wind up drafting, their 6 needs and the 7th spot instead of going to the quarterback. I do wonder if that may be that nose tackle that we're looking for. Now, for edge rushers, you only have 1 roster lock. That's Arnold Ebiketie. Your want to upgrade, there's 2 of those guys, Lorenzo Carter and D'Angelo Malone. Your need to upgrade is Ade Ogundeji. You need to get another edge rusher in here, and ideally, that player is also going to be the starter opposite Arnold Ebiketie. Now, right now, if the season started tomorrow or this Sunday, Lorenzo Carter is a replacement level sort of starter at that edge rusher position, but you do need to get another body in there, and ideally that's a starter. 4 linebackers, 3 roster locks, Caden Ellis, Troy Anderson, Nate Landman. You need to get a 4th linebacker in here. That 4th linebacker currently would be Milo Eifler, who was a practice squad player for the Falcons this past year. I think was active for maybe 2 games as well. But you need to go out there and get a 4th linebacker, probably play special teams, but hopefully that is a sort of depth piece that you can, add some more speed, athleticism to that position. Hopefully, in an ideal world, you're basically drafting another Foye Oluokun in the late rounds, or a Michael Walker type of player with that sort of draft pick. Your 5 cornerbacks, your 2 roster locks are AJ Terrell, D. Alford, penciled in as the sort of starter at that nickel cornerback spot. Your 2 want to upgrades are Mike Hughes and Clark Phillips. Your need to upgrade is Natron Brooks. Now, if the season started this Sunday, you would probably have a competition between now and then between Mike Hughes and Clark Phillips as your starting outside corner opposite AJ Terrell. Now, you need another cornerback in here. And again, similar to other positions, ideally that's a player that can come in and be that starter opposite AJ Terrell, rather than having Mike Hughes and Clark Phillips competing for that spot. And those guys would go back to being relegated as the CB4 and CB5, which is ideally roles for them rather than the CB2 that the Falcons are looking for. The 4 safeties, 3 roster locks, Jesse Bates, Richie Grant, DeMarco Hellams. You need another safety in there right now. That 4th safety would be Micah Abernathy. And again, another spot that ideally that's a starter instead of Richie Grant at that position. And then your 3 special teams players are, of course, roster locks and Younghoe Koo, Bradley Pinion, and Liam McCullough. So those are basically my breakdown of the Falcons team needs. As you saw on your screens, or as I just outlined, I think there are 6 needs: wide receiver, offensive line, edge rusher, linebacker, corner, and safety that you definitely need to hit on if you want to, upgrade this team. And with the Falcons having 7 picks in the upcoming draft, you can take those 6 spots and then add one. And then presumably that's what I was referring to, where that 7th spot will probably either be a quarterback or a nose tackle at this point in time. And for me, at least, part of my frustration with this offseason so far, and again, we'll see what happens. There is a rant in me about how disappointed I am with the Falcons offseason moves so far, but I'm going to punt that till probably next week, hoping that the Falcons will make some moves. But I wanted to see some of those purple areas of their roster that I had as the want to upgrades. Those weren't spots that I was like desperate for the Falcons to draft, but I was hoping that they would be more proactive this offseason to bring in better options than the current options at some of those spots, those purple spots in free agency. Like that to me is where free agency gave you an opportunity to upgrade some of those role players, some of those depth players, some of those, replacement level starters that you may wind up having. And, unfortunately, so far, the Falcons haven't really invested in those areas. So we'll see if they do that over the next month or so between now and the draft. But we're going to leave the team needs aside. I hope you guys have an understanding of sort of my perspective on their team needs, at this point in time, where they need, at least 6 bodies, and then we'll figure out who that 7th spot is at the wide receiver, offensive line, edge, linebacker, corner, and safety spot again. But we'll leave that conversation aside, and we'll turn our attention to our friends over at the Locked On Podcast Network, including Locked On Cardinals, Alex Clancy. We'll talk about Rondale Moore's role in this Falcons offense, what he did in Arizona, where things didn't quite go right, as well as get Alex's relatively unique thoughts on what Desmond Ridder could do as the backup behind Kyler Murray. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, passion, drive, and patience, it's what brings home the winning trophy, and it also is what keeps your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle, level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash, baby. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into that MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. All right, everyone, we are back for another illustrious episode with an illustrious guest, none other than Alex Clancy, the host of Locked On Cardinals. And we're doing a little bit of a mini crossover because the Falcons and Cardinals just made a trade, and they sent Desmond Ridder to the Arizona Cardinals in exchange for Arizona Cardinals wide receiver Rondale Moore. And Alex, of course, is going to tell us his thoughts on the last 3 years of Rondale Moore, former second-round pick. I'm sure Cardinals fans had high hopes for what he could add to that offense, and I guess we'll find out from Alex, and we'll just jump right into it. Alex, did he live up to those hopes?
No, but it wasn't necessarily his fault. He was kind of a victim of his surroundings, and not just directly correlated to Cliff Kingsbury. It's very difficult to find the right spot for a guy like him. And when you do find it, there's no ceiling. Like, they're very, in the NFL, like Lamar Jackson was the first. There are guys that are just like gazelle-like in open space. Gronk was like that, but not as sexy. Like, you just know guys in space where it's just fun to watch. Rondale Moore is like that when he's able to get in space, but they used him too much laterally early on. And then he got injured his rookie year, showed flashes in 2021, but in 2022, but he never really reached that potential maybe we thought he would reach as a second-round pick.
Now, from my watching of Rondale Moore, and maybe this again goes back to what you're talking about with the usage, to me, he seemed like a gadget guy, right? my questions with Rondale Moore when he was coming out of Purdue, we all knew that he was a dynamic player with the ball in his hands, but I wondered, at least with a guy with his size, he's basically would be the equivalent of an outlier in terms of an NFL wide receiver at his size, whether or not that player could, be an effective, true wide receiver in the NFL. And to me, he seemed more in that sort of Tavon Austin sort of role. I'm curious, do you feel like that's due to the Cardinals miscasting him, or, what is your perception to the label that he's only a gadget guy?
I think he's more than a Tavon Austin. But he's not a guy that can read blocks well enough if it's a wide receiver screen to burst. He's a guy that you want to run a 5 or 7 yard slant from the slot, catch the ball, and beat a backer. And then, he could house any ball that he catches in space, especially between the tackles, between the 20s, because he is 0 to 60 immediately. I called him Hollywood Brown and Greg Dortch, the 3 Teslas, like working title, but he's 0 to 60 in 0 seconds flat. So I think really it's keep it simple. When you have more options that other defenders are going to be scheming for, Kyle Pitts, Drake London, Bijan Robinson, like it may be easier for him to fill in that, wide receiver 3, fringe wide receiver 4 role and actually score some touchdowns and have some chunk gains throughout the year.
Okay. Well, obviously you've given us a glimpse of what Rondale Moore is bringing to Atlanta. I do want to pick your brain a little bit on what you think Desmond Ridder is bringing to Arizona. I know last year with the injury to Kyler Murray, a lot of questions about the backup quarterback position, Josh Dobbs, Clayton Tune. There were moments with those guys, but not enough consistency. I'm assuming, the Arizona's looking for Desmond Ridder. And again, consistency may not be the best adjective to describe Desmond Ridder, but I'm assuming Arizona's hoping to get a little bit more consistent play out of the quarterback positions. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I'm geeked. I'm stoked for this. Like he started out of necessity, and then he never had a chance really to blossom. I know he played a bunch of years and he was fringe CFP in college. Cincinnati was so fun. I think he's a less polished but more talented Joshua Dobbs. Like, I think that their skill set is pretty similar. Josh Dobbs runs over people. Desmond Ridder maybe not as much, but if you put him in kind of I actually said this on my show last Friday, say Kyler Murray gets hurt and you run the Denver Broncos Tim Tebow offense with him, I think it could work. I mean, they've got offensive linemen. They've got 3 really, really good blocking tight ends, and you have James Conner, and you just utilize his skill set a little bit more as a runner than as a passer. Not 60-40, 70-30 like Tebow per se, but I feel like if you don't have to put him in situations where he has to make a 3rd and 13 throw down the field, I think he can produce well enough to grow and blossom as a backup quarterback. And I mean, for the price point, it's unmatchable to have a guy who has starting experience, won a handful of games, is going to be sitting behind Kyler Murray.
Now, I'm curious, Alex, because my perspective on this is the Falcons, said a lot of things over the last couple of months as Raheem Morris has been in the building, suggesting that, they weren't necessarily too keen on Ridder's performance last year. And, I think a lot of people wondered, could you really realistically bring him back into your building, given some of the public statements that they've made about the poor quarterback play this past season? And so you kind of needed to move him on and get him a fresh start elsewhere. And I'm curious, is the reverse true with Rondale Moore? Was this a situation where you had a new regime come in, new GM? He's not their guy. That was a Steve Keim, Cliff Kingsbury sort of pick. And they're like, we got Greg Dortch. We got a similar sort of player that can sort of do some of the same things and also, add value on special teams or whatever. This is a player that we don't really need. So we're both teams are kind of looking at it where it's just like, we're dumping a player that we don't like, and maybe we'll be able to get more out of the player that the other team, one team's trash is another team's treasure sort of thing. Yeah.
I mean, in some respects, I think, and I could see that with Ridder. I mean, it's quarterback's different than wide receiver, man. Like if he's not your guy and, it's 50-50, it goes the other way. The funny thing about being your guy or being the guy that drafted whatever, if the player's good, it's the new regime's guy. Like you're not getting rid of a good player just because that tenure didn't draft him. So, if it's 50-50, usually tie goes to the front office. I think there's no reason why Greg Dortch should have outplayed Rondale Moore the last 2 years. There's zero evidence to suggest that with Rondale Moore's skill set, faster, taller, equally as good of hands, not as good of a route runner, there is no reason why Rondale Moore should be the one who's being traded. But because of his performance, that's why he is. All Greg Dortch has done when given the opportunity in small sample sizes and then a little bit more last year's produce. Like, he's now a darling in dynasty fantasy, in deep sleeper fantasy, in 14, 16 team fantasy leagues. Like, national media knows who Greg Dortch is. Nobody knows who Rondale Moore is in this offense. But I think that he can definitely be unlocked with a new scheme and more skill position players around him. So there's no pressure on him to perform, and he can just do what he does.
There you go. Well, guys, you heard it from Alex Clancy of Locked On Cardinals on Rondale Moore. Sure, if you're interested in seeing what Desmond Ridder can do in a new environment, continue to check out Locked On Cardinals moving forward. So appreciate Alex Clancy for joining us on today's Locked On Falcons, but we still got more to come from Locked On Bears hosts Lorin Cox talking about Darnell Mooney and, whether or not the Darnell Mooney we saw in 2021 is that 1,000-yard receiver is the real Darnell Mooney, or the guy that's been arguably a little bit of a disappointment the last 2 years in that number 2 wide receiver role is going to be the guy that stands up for the Falcons this year. And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel, Locked On Sports Today, here on YouTube. And of course, if you're a baseball fan, starting Wednesday, March 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern, which is tomorrow for some of you guys watching, we have an MLB season preview exclusively for Locked On Sports Today, getting you the local experts, find out the latest with the Braves and the Dodgers and the Brewers and whoever else you're interested, all on March 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern time on Locked On Sports Today's 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Now, say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel is going to let you bet on every game of the NCAA tournament, whether you're betting on the big upset or the 1 seed. It's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines, and you can even pick who's going to win it all. And even if you're not that interested in March Madness and you're all about what are the Falcons going to do in the draft, well, guess what? FanDuel has the odds for who's going to be the 8th overall pick. FanDuel has the odds for who's going to be the first defensive player drafted if you think the Falcons are going to take a swing on that guy, right? They're all available at FanDuel.com/lockedon, and you can bet on the NFL draft, or you can bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. All right, everyone, we are back with another illustrious guest. He is Lorin Cox of the Locked On Bears podcast, and he's here with us to talk a little bit about not Justin Fields, but Darnell Mooney, the former Chicago Bears at the Falcons so far this offseason. I know Ryan Pace is secretly tinkering in the dungeon somewhere to get more Bears here, but so far the only former Bear that the Falcons have added this offseason. But Lorin, my friend, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It feels weirdly familiar. We've done this a lot over the last couple of years.
Yes, we have. Yes, we have. So let's talk about the most recent former Bear to join the Atlanta Falcons, is Darnell Mooney. And looking at Darnell Mooney's sort of career in Chicago over the last 4 years, sort of ups and downs, right? He had that sort of breakout year in 2021 where he had over 80 catches, over 1,000 yards, but then kind of fell back down to earth the last couple of seasons where he only combined for a little more than 70 catches and 900 yards in those 2 years. So I guess my question to you, Lorin, is, in your opinion, which is the real Darnell Mooney? Is that 1,000-yard receiver the real guy, or is it more the guy that's getting 400, 500 yards these last couple of years?
The real Darnell Mooney is probably somewhere in between. I don't think he's a guy that you should set the expectation of 1,000 yards every year. Like that 2021 team, it was a great year for him individually. He had a great season, but there wasn't a lot else at wide receiver that he was really competing with there. Like Allen Robinson was in and out of the lineup, and everybody else in that group was not anything to write home about. But at the same time, then the last 2 seasons, the offense has not been nearly as productive. The offensive coordinating hasn't felt like it's been putting, especially receivers, in the best position to be successful. And it felt like Darnell Mooney was an underutilized asset in Chicago the last couple of seasons, and kept kind of trying to find an answer as to when or where or why, because you watch the tape and he's getting open, and sometimes it's Fields seeing him and not pulling the trigger. Sometimes it's him not being early enough in the progression. And sometimes it's him, running routes where he's a decoy or he's taking the top off just to kind of clear out routes. And it just never felt like Darnell Mooney was being like optimized for his skill set to be as productive as he'd been earlier in his career. So I think he'll get back to being a lot more than just a 400-yard receiver from the last couple of years. But like, especially in that Atlanta offense, when you've already got, Drake London, Bijan Robinson, Kyle Pitts, et cetera, like, I just don't think he's going to get enough touches to be that 1,000-yard guy either.
That's fair. That's fair. Now you talk about his skill set and, putting him in the best position to succeed. I guess my other question is, what is kind of the ideal role for Darnell Mooney, right? He's been used in the slot. He's been used as an outside receiver. Do you sort of think one of those roles fits better for him, or does he have this sort of versatility where it doesn't really matter where he lines up? He can do, the things from either role.
Yeah, I think he can definitely do things from either role. And I don't think he needs to be limited to one or the other, but I do think I do think the slot is an opportunity for him to get a little bit more of a free release off the line of scrimmage. I think it's not like you jam him and he's taken out of a play by any means, but like, he's not a big, strong physical receiver at the line of scrimmage, right? I mean, he's shifty with his releases, so you're not really going to hold him down the whole route, but if you can give him those opportunities to get a free release, being off the line of scrimmage in the slot, or, putting him in some pre-snap motion, that can help him, get a little bit of that earlier start in the route. But I think for me, he's fast. He's an effective route runner. He's a hard worker. He's a willing blocker. Like, you're never going to mistake him for a jump ball receiver, but he can win up and down the field. He can win over the middle of the field. He can run the whole route tree really well. Like, there's a lot to really like about Darnell Mooney.
Now, last question I have for you, in a similar vein, he does have that speed to sort of take the top off the defense. Can he be like a true deep threat type of weapon? Do you think, is that something that could be more utilized by the Atlanta Falcons, or do you feel like the Bears probably were able to maximize that skill set?
I think they were able to maximize it early on in his career, right? But they weren't maximizing anything this past season. Like, he's definitely a vertical deep threat, a guy that you throw it up and he's going to run underneath it and go up, and not go up and get it, but like go under it and get it, go deep and go find a way to get underneath it. Like, I don't think he's like elite at, like stacking the cornerback behind him. And there's some little nuances to deep ball play where it's like, he's not this elite deep threat that you see like the true best of the best across the NFL, or just there's a certain savviness to it. But he's got the speed and the understanding of like where to go and where coverages are going to try and attack him. Okay, the safety's coming from this angle. I need to adjust my route a little bit to the outside, or, however it might be. Like, he's got some of that there, and he's got the speed to be the deep threat. It's just a matter of, does it line up with him, the kind of coverage he's getting across from him, and then where he is in the progression for the quarterback. But I do think that's an area where you can see him add that dynamic to the Falcons offense for sure.
Okay. Well, Lorin, I appreciate your insight into Darnell Mooney. We'll continue to discuss what he can do in Atlanta in the future. Here, let the people know, some of the things you're talking on Locked On Bears. I imagine it's a lot of Caleb Williams all the time now for the next 5+ weeks, right?
Yeah, now post Justin Fields trade, that's where my life is now. We can finally move on with our lives instead of having like 1 foot in, 1 foot out with the draft and the quarterbacks. We've got a real direction here. And I will say about Darnell Mooney, like, beloved. No one had a bad word to say about him in Chicago. Bears fans absolutely loved him. Wanted the offense to be able to do more for him. He had a couple of drops this past season that people were really getting him on, but that to me felt just like frustration from the fan base more than anything else over him not being particularly utilized properly. But like, he's an exciting player that everyone's going to be rooting for, and we're certainly happy that he got the kind of money that he did. And I think Falcons fans are going to be really happy with him too.
Okay. Well, that Ryan Pace pipeline has worked out pretty well for the Falcons. So we'll see if it continues working for them. But Lorin, I really appreciate you joining me on today's Locked On Falcons, and look forward to all the Caleb Williams content coming on Locked On Bears in the coming month.
Thanks for having me.
So, guys, that's going to do it for us here. Appreciate Lorin Cox as well as Alex Clancy, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Continue to stay tuned to Locked On Falcons as your first listen. Tomorrow we'll probably talk maybe pass rushers. Maybe we'll talk about Bijan Robinson and his fit under Zach Robinson in this offense. So make us your first listen tomorrow. For your second listens, continue to check out Locked On NFL, especially Locked On Sports Today's 24 streaming channel, especially Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time for that MLB season preview. Of course, Locked On Sports Atlanta has a 24/7 streaming channel here on YouTube and Amazon Fire TV channels app. So it's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.